So I am thrilled for our speaker this afternoon, Adesanya. I met Ade probably 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago.
I think three.
And he's a Renaissance man. He's not just a founder. He's also organized an angel group and and has been able to keep his startup going through the pandemic. So Ade's topic today is an interesting one. To those of us who practice entrepreneurship, product market fit is incredibly important to any startup. Knowing who your customers are and what their needs are is incredibly important to a startup. We would argue so important that you should probably be talking to customers before you even have a product. Ade, I'm thrilled to hear your presentation, and I'm just going to turn it over to you and have you take the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike, and hi everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm super excited to be talking to you and to share my experience. Mike has been a good friend, a mentor over the years, especially with my nonprofit I've been working on. He helped lead one of our workshops on angel investing, and so that was very, very helpful. So today, the goal for today's talk is to talk. The title of today's talk is how to find the right idea for your innovation. I think many of us on the call today are entrepreneurs, and we all have great ideas. Some of them we get them in the shower, and the question is always, how do we monetize this? And the way I'm going to do it today is I'm going to spend the first half of the talk just telling you my story and kind of my own journey in figuring out how to commercialize my idea. And then I have a few slides where we kind of go through some of the frameworks that I've used personally to build my company. So let's jump in. Just personally, I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. So I'm Nigerian by birth. Growing up, my first experience with entrepreneurship was watching my dad. He started his first company when I was 3 years old in our 3-bedroom apartment. And so we slept in one bedroom and the rest of the apartment was the office. And so I got to grow up in a startup firsthand. One of the things that really drew me to entrepreneurship is just watching him build that company from a 3-person organization to 30, 50 people, and watching the impact that entrepreneurship made in their lives, in the fact that many of them were able to, because they had a job with my dad, they were able to go buy a car, send the kids to school, build houses. And coming from a country where there's a lot of poverty, that to me just kind of made entrepreneurship very attractive, in knowing that entrepreneurship could be a force for social good. And so I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship as a person, and I live to support entrepreneurs. So in terms of coming to America, in watching my dad, when it was time to go to college, I wanted to study engineering because my dad did the same thing. And so I went to the University of Houston originally to study electrical engineering. And the choice for Houston was interesting because I got applied to, I think, 6 different schools in the US. I got into all of them. And my dad was like, hey, kiddo, so where do you want to go to school? And I'm like, where's the warmest? And he's like, I think Houston, Texas. And for me personally, I had watched too many Hollywood movies growing up in Nigeria. And you see the snow during Christmas time. And I was like, that doesn't look like a good idea. So Houston was a good fit for me back then. So I went to Houston, studied electrical engineering, and while I was, in my junior year, I kind of got bored, so the engineering stuff was pretty cool, and I understood it. I was getting good grades, but I wanted to do something more creative. And at that time, that was when we were experiencing the media boom. Facebook, Twitter, and a bunch of other companies. And me and a group of my friends, we went to go see the Social Network movie, and we left that movie being so inspired, with just a Facebook family story. So we set out to launch a company, and we didn't know what the idea was going to be. And so we started looking for different ideas on campus that we could solve. And one of the ideas we landed on was, when you're on campus, one of the things you do every semester is buy textbooks. And you go to the bookstore, you buy a book for $120. And at the end of the semester, the bookstore offers you maybe $30, $40 for it. And then they mark it up and sell it for $90 the following semester. And we thought that, hey, this is a travesty. And so we set out to build a way to allow people on campus to buy and sell textbooks with each other. And as we're building the idea, it kind of struck us that there was a bigger thesis here, which was, in a community like a college campus, you could be walking past someone that has the textbook that you need, or, has a camera or something that you may want. And, you just never know. So we built this platform called Gift House, and the idea was that the platform allowed people to either give, trade, or sell services, books to different people on campus. And we grew that to about 3,000 users on campus, and that was one of the highlights of my undergrad experience. And I think, unfortunately for us back then, we were in Houston, Texas, and Houston didn't have a lot of of an entrepreneurship ecosystem. Every mentor I had was an oil and gas businessman, and they couldn't really advise me on how to build a tech company. And so I decided after I graduated that I wanted to move to California and come to Silicon Valley and see come to the heart of where all the action is. So I applied to I was applying to different graduate programs in California, and I got into USC's engineering management program. The cool thing about USC was I also got a job before I moved in the innovation center at USC. They were looking for someone who had an engineering background who could help professors who had gotten patents to find to essentially spin off those patents into new startup ventures. And so I applied to both USC and I applied to the job, and I got into both of them. At this point, I had never been to LA before. And so I paid someone to drive my car from Houston to LAX. And I flew to LAX and I picked up my car and I was in LA. And that's kind of my foray to LA. USC was a great experience for me, but I really learned a lot at my job at USC. The job was very interesting because essentially we had different patents that we had gotten as a school, and we're looking to spin them off into new startup ventures. And for every idea, we had to do some market research. We had to find an entrepreneur who had done something similar and kind of get them to be a mentor for the researcher that had developed that idea. And then we did a lot of customer discovery, talking to customers, and eventually we tried to spin those ideas of out of the university to help them raise venture capital and things like that. And I learned a whole lot about just commercializing technologies and ideas from that experience. One of the fortunate things that happened to me during that time was I got to meet my co-founders for my current company, Movn Analytics. So my boss back then, this is now almost 9 years ago, assigned me a project, which was my business partner, Harsh, had gotten a patent around using smartphones to track physical activity and motivating older adults to exercise more. And so he came in with this patent and was telling me about how sitting and being sedentary is the new smoking, and he was on a mission to solve this problem. One of the things that was interesting to me about him back then was I'd worked on different ideas at USC trying to spin them off, and many of them, even though the technology itself was awesome, many of them didn't really have a chance of being successful, and that was because the researchers weren't committed to being entrepreneurs. They wanted to be researchers and develop the technology, but they didn't want to go launch a startup and focus on it full time. And Harsh, back then was thinking the opposite way. He didn't want to be a professor or an academic. He wanted to build a company that reached millions of people. So I said, this idea is an interesting idea, but I think both of us are smart enough to go figure out how we can build a business around it. So the question I posed to him back then was, we all know we should be exercising, right? And we don't all exercise, at least as frequently as we should. And so I was like, where in healthcare is exercise so important to the recovery process that that people would be motivated to do it. And I think one of the things about, thinking about how you commercialize your idea is understanding the difference between, they call it like a vitamin or a painkiller, right? Some ideas are vitamins, which, they're nice to have, they solve problems. They may not be very deep problems, but, they're nice. And you have some ideas that are, what you call painkillers, that are solving a problem that's so core and so fundamental that like a customer will literally pay you money before you build the product. And so, back then it was very important to me that we found a problem that was so, core and so painful that we could really build a business around. So we went on this exercise of just talking to, we said, hey, we don't know the answer to this question. We don't know where exercise is the most important in healthcare, but why don't we go to the hospital and go talk to many clinicians? So we set out on a journey to interview 100 clinicians and ask them about, where they thought exercise was important in healthcare, and we wanted to see what we could learn from it. And as we talked to many clinicians, one of the things they started telling us was that for people who have chronic diseases like diabetes or heart disease, exercise was very important in preventing the disease. But after someone gets it, it was also important in the recovery process. And so we started to get some ideas that we could do something around chronic disease management with the technology we had. But we got our big idea, and it was in a very unusual way. So I was at an event at Google in Santa Monica, and the MC said, make sure you talk to 10 people before you leave here. And I was on number 7, and I was about to just, call it quits and go home. And there was a gentleman standing in front of me, and I said to just let me talk to the 8th person, and I'll call it quits from here. And he told me that he worked for the American Heart Association. So I got pretty intrigued by his work, and I was telling him about this research this technology I was trying to figure out. And he told me to send him a proposal on how I thought our technology could help the American Heart Association in their mission. And we sent them a few proposals, but they came back to us and said, hey, have you guys looked at cardiac rehab? And we're like, what's that? And so we started doing some research, and we found that, for people who've recently had an acute cardiac event, like a heart attack or a heart surgery, cardiac rehab is this service that, essentially helps those patients with their recovery and learning new behavior so that they don't get a second heart attack. And a lot of cardiac rehab is actually exercise. And so they were like, hey, you guys should really look at cardiac rehab, because that could be a good market for you. And so we had done our first set of 100 interviews, to kind of figure out like what we should be doing. But when we found out about this cardiac rehab problem, we did another set of 100 interviews. And so we called up 100 rehab centers and said, hey, we are grad students at USC. We're trying to build an app for cardiac rehab, but we have no idea of what cardiac rehab is. So we said, can you tell us what you do, what the biggest problem in cardiac rehab is, and what you think the future is? And everybody told us that cardiac rehab was this great service. The problem in cardiac rehab today was that less than 20% of people enrolled in the first rehab session because there were very few cardiac rehab centers in the space. So you think about in Los Angeles, in the greater LA area, there's only maybe 3 or 4 cardiac rehab programs. So you can imagine, trying to get into one in the middle of the day with traffic and everything, it's really difficult. So they told us that if there was a way for them to do cardiac rehab at home, that would be amazing. And so we took this, we latched on to that in terms of like, hey, people actually want to do cardiac rehab at home, and maybe we can take our technology and repurpose it for that. So one of the things we learned in also talking to all the customers was that in healthcare, it was very important that anything you did was based on very strong clinical science. So I'll give you an example. When you think about what's happening right now with COVID and the vaccine, these companies had to develop a vaccine, and they had to do different clinical studies. And then based on the outcomes of those studies, the FDA and Dr. Fauci and everybody had to say, okay, this looks safe for people. So in healthcare, one of the things that was very critical to to launching any product was to make sure that your product had, some kind of evidence behind it. So we said, if we're going to do something in cardiac rehab, let's go look for who's done any kind of research in home or virtual cardiac rehab. And so as we started to do research, we found that at Stanford, they had developed this home-based clinical model for delivering cardiac rehab at home. And they did different clinical studies that showed that patients who did that model for cardiac rehab actually had much better outcomes, and they also had a much higher participation rate. So I think the participation rate in the clinical studies were 80% versus like in day-to-day brick and mortar cardiac rehab, which was 20%. And so we got pretty intrigued by that. And so we picked up the phone and we called the clinicians at Stanford that developed this program. And we said, hey, we're grad students at USC. We're trying to build an app for cardiac rehab. We found out about your great research and we want to learn more. And so back then we found an excuse to talk to the team at Stanford every week. We'll come up with a question and we use those questions as a way to build a relationship with them. And so we went from having 20-minute phone calls to hour-long phone calls. And eventually we actually started going up to Palo Alto to hang out with them. And in 2015, we convinced them to license us their research. And we decided that we were going to essentially take their research and digitize it and build a product from that research. And so we were able to convince them. And, it was pretty interesting because we're both two, I guess, grad students that, we were able to convince a clinical team at Stanford to go to their licensing office to license us their research. And so we got an exclusive global license from Stanford to their research. And then we were able to use that to raise venture capital. We raised our first round, I think we raised $1.5 million. And then we built the first version of the product and we took it to market. And so that's kind of been my journey to kind of, where I am. I think in terms of for our product itself, we've gone through different iterations of what the product is and who the customer is. Initially, we started out selling our product to cardiac rehab centers. And we learned a lot by talking to many of them. And we figured out that they were not the right customer for us. So we eventually kind of landed on selling to health insurers. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about today is just kind of like some of the frameworks that we've used in growing my company and the product. So today, last year we served about 2,000 patients. We've to date raised pretty close to $9 million in venture capital. And so I'm going to start to share my screen now, and we're going to talk through some of the frameworks that I've used and I've learned along the way. But before we get into that, I just wanted to kind of pause here to see if there's any questions from the audience just about my journey, my process, before we kind of get into the presentation formally.
You can either try raising your hand, or you can also type a question into the chat box. We'll keep an eye on the chat box too.
Yep.
I have a question.
Right.
What kind of business was your dad's startup?
It was a software company actually in Nigeria. Software. So they wrote the software that read the electric meters and printed your electricity bill.
Oh, cool. Very cool. I saw John Ikudaisi had his hand raised. John.
Yes, I
John,
did.
what's up, man?
Hey, how you doing, Ade? Great story so far. I'm kind of interested in how you approached the cardiac rehab facilities, because I find that, medical centers and healthcare providers, one, are pressed for time typically, and two, don't respond very well to like a sales approach. So I'm curious as to, what your approach was getting that first 100, user or customer feedback.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's true. I think one of the benefits we had when we started the company was we were still in grad school. So it was easy to tell someone, hey, we're graduate students and we're trying to do some research. Do you have some time for a student? And many people were very generous with their time. Obviously now, as we become a more established company, I think, in terms of finding customers, it really helps to kind of work your network, and try to get warm introductions to people. The other way to do customer discovery is also to attend, conferences and events that, your customers may be at, because then you can kind of just catch them in a place where they're not, on their jobs. Clinicians are very busy, and it's more, you have the opportunity to have more of an organic conversation. So that's, always a difficult thing, but the more you can try and find either warm introductions or meet people in a more relaxed atmosphere, I think those are two ways that, we've used to kind of go over that hump.
Perfect, thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen and we get into the presentation for today. Can everybody see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Yay. All right, so let's do this. So I already shared my story. So today we'll talk about, 3 frameworks for commercializing your idea. So the first is just kind of understanding customers and who they are and archetypes. And then we'll talk about customer development model, and we'll talk about the business model canvas. And so let's jump in. So we all have ideas, right? And the question is, what makes one a good startup idea that, you're going to commit a significant amount of your life and time in trying to solve? And so, at a very high level, when you think about what are good ideas, I think you want to find something that's a tangible problem. Again, kind of the idea of, is your solution a painkiller or is it a vitamin, right? We could all, we all know vitamins are important, but, vitamins we could do without them. But when you have a very bad headache, or migraine, finding that painkiller is always very important. And so we kind of want to find these problems that are very core. I think one of the things that's interesting about where we are now as an ecosystem, is that a lot of the ideas that you could probably think about in the shower are probably executed on already. But I think where you can find a lot of the great ideas now is at your job, right? So we all are working different jobs, and there are different problems that we encounter every day in our jobs. That's because of there's always going to be inefficiencies, in different processes and things like that. So I think, one of the places I always encourage people to look for good ideas is kind of just think about the problems that frustrate you every day doing your job or living your life, and then try and hack a solution. And, if you can hack it, then that may be a good source for your next big idea. So that's kind of one, thinking about what makes a good startup idea. The problem has to be solid and needs to be something that's really painful. Second is the market, right? So business at the end of it comes down to how many people can you sell your product to, and that's what's going to determine how big of a market and how big of a company you're going to have. And then third is just your team's ability to create a solution for that market. So I think these are the 3 criteria, as we start to think about how we commercialize the idea. These are 3 criteria you need to really think through to kind of sieve your ideas and figure out which ones work. So, for most people, when they think about an idea, a lot of people get very excited about the idea. So they have a concept, they hack together a solution. Some people, if you're fortunate to be a developer, maybe you go build an app, and then you test to make sure the app is working and you go launch it, right? And a lot of times people do this process and they end up having spent a lot of time and money, and they kind of end up in a place where they don't really have a lot of customers. And they've made a lot of these big investments. And so this is the traditional way kind of most people think about like starting startups and trying to commercialize their ideas, is to go in a very linear fashion. But this, this approach often, doesn't quite work. And one of the things why, one of the reasons why it doesn't work is a lot of people don't understand what a startup is, So if I asked you what a startup was, I guess let me actually pause here and let's make this interactive. So does anyone want to volunteer, to just kind of define what a startup is in the audience?
I'll give it a go really quickly.
Okay.
Say a highly scalable, fast-growing company. That's what I'll default to.
Okay, good idea. Any other takers? Don't be shy.
I think I would define one as a company that is in its initial stages of business.
Okay.
It hasn't really, levitated off the ground. It's still in the formation process.
Yep. That's a good idea. A good answer. Any other suggestions on what a startup is?
A high growth tech company.
Okay. So those are great answers. And I think that is kind of one of the things I want to challenge today is the idea of what a startup is, right? So a startup, and I'm using a definition from a book called, it's called, let me see if I can pull up the name of the book really quickly. It's called The Startup Owner's Manual by Steve Blank. It's a great book. And I have a link to the book at the end of the presentation. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model, right? And one of the things that I kind of want you to really think about in this definition, it says a startup is temporary, right? So this startup, right? So there's a business, right? And we talked about like high growth, scalable, that's a company, right? That's not a startup, right? A startup is really an organization that is designed to find a repeatable and scalable model. So once your business kind of like you find a repeatable business model and that scales, you're no longer a startup, right? And so this is very important to understand because it means a couple of things that like startups are essentially kind of looking for a business model, and that's what you're trying to do as a startup is to find that. So the primary objective of a startup is really to validate its business model and pivot until it does it. So as a startup, you're kind of experimenting to find the right idea, and the goal is really to find the right idea and talk to people to validate it. Until you do that, you really don't have a company. You're still kind of a startup, right? And so I think that's one thing I want you to kind of take away from today is just really challenge that idea of what a startup is that, a startup is searching for a business model, and that's what they're doing. And at the heart of, what, a startup is who's a customer, right? So let's also open this back up to everybody. What's your take on who a customer is?
Someone that's willing to pay for your services.
Exactly. That's a good answer. Any other take on who a customer is? All right, so we can roll with that. So that's a perfect answer. A customer is who pays. And one of the things that, it's not always obvious, right? But is that a lot of times there are nuances in who the customer is, right? At the end of the day, customers who pays. But in every business, there are always other stakeholders that are part of that customer, or a customer could be made up of different stakeholders. So you have end users, right? End users are people who end up using your product. So when you think about my business, right, we have a virtual cardiac rehab company. We're helping people who had a heart attack to recover. The patients are end users. They're not the customer, right? But they're the end users, right, of our product. You also have influencers, right? Influencers are people who influence that decision-making process, right? And so you have people like, in my case, like the doctor is going to be an influencer, right? They can decide that they can say no, but they can't say yes, right? So the doctor can say, hey, I'm going to have my patient use this, but, they really aren't the people that are writing the check for it. And then you have the decision makers, right? Decision makers are people who actually have a budget and are going to say yes or no, to your solution. And so that usually is an executive at the company who has a budget and who's going to prioritize this. That's who a decision maker is. And then you have finally a buyer. A buyer, it's more of an administrative role. These are people within an organization who are going to process that procurement or, however you buy it. So depending on your idea, this could be the same person, So if you think about like if you had a consumer product, so let's say you made a new toy, right? The end user could be a child, right? The influencers are going to be maybe the child's friends, right? The decision makers are going to be the parents, and the buyers are also going to be parents. So for every idea, when you think about a customer, These are kind of like some nuances into what makes a customer, and it's important for you to kind of understand this and map it out, because of a lot of times, the more you understand these different stakeholders and their perspective about your problem, the better you can build a solution that's going to be more attractive to them, and so they can actually make a sale. So one of the things that's also very important to think about in commercializing your idea is the different types of customers. So on the screen, we have a framework called the technology adoption lifecycle. I took this image out of a book called Crossing the Chasm, and it talks about that for every innovation, there are 5 types of customers. So you have innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. And we'll kind of define all of those customers in the next couple of slides. So innovators are people who, they seek out new technology. They are the geeks that always want to try the newest things and the latest things. They're the people who bought the first Tesla Roadster, before Tesla had its supercharging network. And these are people who are willing to overlook a lot of the problems that your idea may have or your innovation may have, and just buy it just based on the technology merit of it. So those are innovators, and we'll come back to them. Early adopters are people who, they are quick to understand the benefits of new technology. They're kind of visionaries. Like the innovators, they're a little bit more practical. They've probably tried to solve the problem that you're solving already, and they failed. And they're looking for a solution to solve it. So they're actively looking for a solution. They want your product to be a little bit more refined, but not too well developed. So those are early adopters. And so one of the things that's very important to think about in early adopters, and why you kind of want to target this initial set of customers, for your idea, is that they have a budget, right? They already are looking for something they want to buy. They already have a budget. They've tried to solve this problem before. They're actively looking, and they are aware that they have a problem. One of the things that's interesting, especially if you have a startup that's selling to enterprises, is that not a lot of customers are aware of the problem that they have. And a lot of time you spend time really trying to educate people that, hey, you have this problem, and they haven't really taken a look at it. Early adopters know they have a problem. They're looking for a solution. And this is why kind of marketing is important, so that those people can find you. The next step, the next type of customer is the early majority. So these are people that are very practical consumers. They are people who adopt a product after the product has been well validated. They're people who bought maybe the iPhone 4. They didn't buy the iPhone 1, 2, or 3 because they were waiting for a lot of the bugs to be fixed. And they don't want to. They want to use something that works, that's proven already. And these are going to be the majority of your customers. And then we have the late majority. So these are people who absolutely wait for something, for an innovation to be very well established. They don't want to. They're very conservative in their outlook. But they buy products because of, they really just don't have a choice. It's like right now, if you're walking to Verizon, it's very hard not to buy a smartphone, because when you look at the store, that's the only thing that they have, in the store. And the last people are laggards. Laggards are people that are just skeptical about, technology and innovation. Maybe they've tried a technology in the past, that was trying to solve that problem, and they got burnt about it. And so they just are very negative, right? And so as a startup, kind of going back to this picture, one of the things you're trying to do is really identify and reach the innovators and early adopters, because these are people that are going to work with you to really, one, validate your idea, two, help you build your product, and three, they're actually going to pay you to try and solve that problem. And so they're very, very critical. And we really want to spend a lot of time in trying to identify these people. And what differentiates a startup, from a company, right, is that they cross this chasm, right, where, to jump from early adopters to the early majority, it takes a little bit of skill set and growth. And so startups really kind of like are trying to cross this chasm and get to the early majority. So we can talk a lot about this. I encourage you to read a book called Crossing the Chasm. It really talks about this concept of like the different customers and how you kind of move from each phase of the customer development cycle. But we're going to spend the rest of this presentation kind of just talking about how do you actually engage, identify, and talk to your innovator and early adopter type customers. I kind of also want to use this as a point to just kind of pause and check in with the audience and see if there are any questions, just about, what we talked about so far before we keep going.
Yeah, I have a question right here.
Go ahead.
I just turned on my, so my question is, I'm in a marketing class right now, just to get back to marketing. And a lot of marketing, there's different forms of marketing, like where you highlight what the product differentiation is, like how it differentiates in the marketplace, how the markets or how the product's different from other products in the marketplace, things like that. When are you highlighting in a market, there's a life cycle in a marketing process too. Where are you, how early are you saying like, for example, I'll talk about Pampers diapers. Yeah. The little plastic lining, where are you differentiating? Mine's better at not being messy versus the other one. Like, where are you highlighting your product differentiation in your product when you're marketing to these different cohorts of class of customers? Yeah. So I think, there's two ways to kind of think about that challenge, right? So it's, who are you marketing that to, right? And when. So for that kind of innovation, I think if your problem, once you get to marketing, you're already selling to the early majority, right? When you think about this cycle, a lot of times, as startups, we're trying to figure out who's the right customer to start with, right? And we're doing a lot of customer discovery and research. And then we get to the place where once we figure that out, we start to do marketing and ads and things like that. So before you kind of get into like doing those things, you kind of have to figure out that part. So for that problem and this scenario you kind of said, I would say that you're really starting to market to early majority customers and late majority customers, who have already used the solution before and are looking for alternatives. And you're trying to then say, hey, my product is different from another product. And so those will be the majority of the market. And if you think about this graph, right, it's kind of like a Six Sigma curve where, the majority of the market are these two categories of people. And this is where you eventually want to get to with the technology. But initially, you're trying to figure out, this first two so you can get here. Well, hopefully that's helpful, but I can maybe also paraphrase it if it wasn't clear. Oh, that makes perfect sense. Thanks.
Any other questions so far? All right, so let's keep going with the presentation. So one of the things I want to kind of talk about today is just a framework that you can use to identify those customers, especially the innovators and early adopters. And it's really called the customer development model. And the framework or the thesis is that, we talked about, a lot of times people just have an idea, they build a product and they take it to market, but you kind of want to figure out who your customer is first. And so before you start to invest in a product, and then you that way you save money and you save a lot of time. So this framework called customer development essentially has 4 phases. So it says for any innovation, you kind of want to start with customer discovery, which is like actively finding who your customer is. And when you find those people, you want to validate that the customer. And once you validate that the customer, you then kind of start to create and build a company. And so we'll kind of walk through we'll break that down a little bit. So in customer discovery, the idea here is that you don't know, right, who your customer is yet. You're not sure what the solution is. You may have an idea, right? You may have like a concept, and that's a thesis, right? Like it's an idea you have. And what you're trying to do is really validate with a customer that problem is real and it's something that they'll pay for before you actually start to build it. So the art of customer discovery, which is the first part of this customer development process, is that you write out your idea and your vision, right? And you write into a business model canvas, which we'll talk about today. And then you develop a plan to test your idea with customers, right? So the rule of thumb in customer discovery is that you want to try and talk to at least 100 customers, so that you get a very large sample size of people giving you feedback on your idea before you actually go build it. And the goal of that 100 is that you're really going to get some statistical significant feedback on what people think is a real problem that you should be solving. And so once you kind of like have that idea and you write it out, then you want to kind of start to validate with customers. So even before you launch a product, right, test if people will pay for it. So it's like, you put up a landing page, tell people to sign up, test if they will actually pay you ahead of time to build your stuff, right? And it's kind of like difficult to think about it where you're like, hey, how am I going to get someone to pay for a product that doesn't exist? But if you can actually get someone to do that, when you think about Kickstarter, right? People who take their products and they take it on Kickstarter, what they're doing is trying to do customer validation, right? They're saying, here's the concept, right? But they try and get you to buy it before they actually make it. And it really validates as a business. So if today I launch a Kickstarter campaign and I get 5,000 people to sign up and to buy my product, then I know for sure that there's like 5,000 people in the world who want to buy this. And that those kind of products are more likely to be successful because they have customer validation. And so once you validate that there's a customer base, right? Then you can move on to what you call customer creation. So this is where you start to build out a product, you start to build up a company, you go raise venture capital and things like that. And then you start to build an established company that has a bunch of processes. So these are different phases of just that whole, commercialization process is trying to find the right customers, right, for your idea. And if you don't find them, kind of go back to the drawing board and try to figure it out. So the goal here, right, is to go from a startup to a company, right? And once a company has found its business model, that means it knows its market, it knows its customers, you kind of validated how much your price or how much you can charge for it. Then you go from searching and being a startup to executing, which is what companies do. So startups search for a business model and companies executing is the business model. And these are two differences between a startup and a company. So here's some thoughts. This is taken from a book called The Startup Owner's Manual, written by Steve Blank. And it talks about customer development manifesto. So these are kind of like just some principles you should think about in terms of customer discovery. So the first is that there's no facts inside the building, or I'd say there are no facts inside your head, right? So we all have ideas and they're just ideas, but they're not validated. And the only way to get it validated is to go outside and go talk to people. So pick up the phone, talk to someone that you think is a customer, once things get back to normal, go visit a business and ask them, if they really have a problem. But the idea here is that you can't just rely on your own intuition to validate a problem. You really have to go out there and talk to people. The second is, to pair customer development with agile development. What that means is that, in developing a solution or developing, apps and things like that, you kind of want to be building it based on customer feedback. And so as you talk to people and they give you feedback, you want to build your technology slowly based on feedback, so that, again, you don't end up spending too much time, building something that nobody wants. The third piece of this, framework is failure is an integral part of search, right? So startups are looking for a solution, right? Or they're looking for a repeatable business model. And it's okay to fail, right? It's okay for you to do your research and end up saying, hey, we had an idea, we did our customer discovery, we talked to 100 plus customers, and we learned that, there's really not a market for what we're doing. That's perfectly okay. And it's so important that you kind of get this customer discovery done early so that you can decide and determine if there's really a market there. A lot of people, a lot of businesses fail because they think they have a product and a solution, and they spend a lot of time building it out, and they haven't really kind of done the customer discovery process, and they don't fail early enough, and so they end up wasting a lot of time and money. So the fourth point in this, manifesto is that, it's about iterations and pivots, right? So you talk to a customer today, you kind of have, maybe you have an original idea, I talk to a customer, and you kind of want to listen for things that, would really make that customer buy. And you start to iterate your product or your vision or idea, and you start to make pivots so that you can get closer to what a customer wants. And pivoting is so important. I think every company is going to have to pivot one way or the other, because you never really kind of get the right idea the first time. And so, just be open-minded. That's kind of what that's saying. The fifth is, no business plan or no idea survives the first contact with the customer, right? And so kind of going back to the fourth point, you're really going to, have that, you're going to have to adopt that idea. You're going to make mistakes, right? And so the goal here is not to be hard on yourself, that, someone didn't think your idea was great, but it's to kind of have you think through, what does a customer really want, right? And not be married to your idea, The sixth is, design experiment to test and validate your hypothesis. Again, every idea is a hypothesis. And what you want to do is you want to validate that someone will actually care about the idea, or care about your solution enough to pay for it. So these are some high-level frameworks and philosophies, for us to think about as we get into customer discovery. So one of the helpful tools that is very powerful, it's a very powerful tool for customer discovery, is called the business model canvas. So the business model canvas is a very easy way to kind of write out your idea. And it's really comprehensive, and it helps you to think through every aspect of a potential idea of business. So in this canvas, this is, and if you Google it, you find different templates and different resources that are going to explain it much better than I can. What the idea of the business model canvas says, every idea of every business has 9 fundamental building blocks, right? So you're going to have a customer and who your customer is. You're going to have a value proposition, which is going to be your solution for that customer's problem. And you're going to have to then have key activities. So what are going to be the key activities that you do as a business to bring your solution to the customer? You're going to need resources to get that done. You're going to need partners. You're going to have to market your product to different channels. You're going to have different types of relationships with your customer. And it's going to be very important for you to think about what those relationships are. And then eventually you're going to have a cost structure and a pricing model. And so this is a very, very good tool. A lot of times in the past, people used to write, 40-page, 100-page business plans. The business model canvas is really a good tool to use to just take your idea and just articulate it, right? So, for every idea, what you want to do is write, who do I think my customer is? What do I think the value proposition is? What are the key activities I think I'm going to need to do to bring this business to life? What are the resources I need? What's going to be my pricing model, my cost structure, and things like that. And so in customer discovery, the idea here is that you write your idea on a business model canvas, and then you go talk to customers, right? And as you talk to customers, they're going to tell you different things about these different blocks. And then you iterate on your business model canvas. So today, I may start with version A of this, but then I go talk to 10 customers, and then I come back to this canvas and say, hey, what did I learn from those interviews? Have I learned something different? Has my hypothesis on who a customer is, has that changed? And so this allows you to organize your thoughts, and it's a very just good process for you to really start to ask questions about your idea in terms of who the customer is, what your revenue model, and things like that. So I highly suggest that you search about the business model canvas if you haven't, and if you're not familiar with it, to read more about it. It's a very powerful tool that helps you to just articulate your idea. And it's also a very good tool to talk to your team about your idea, so that everybody kind of has one framework to communicate what the idea is. So 4 questions you think about as you think about commercializing your idea is, have you identified a problem you want a customer wants to see solved? Does your product solve this customer's problem? Do you have a profitable model, and have you learned enough to go out and sell? So the whole idea of customer discovery, right, is to really identify that problem that a customer has that they're really going to, pay you to solve. And once you figure out that idea, then you start to think about, okay, how am I going to price this in a way that is going to be profitable for me as a company to be sustainable and to scale long term. So that's a lot of the lecture today. It's kind of like an introduction to some of these concepts here. For you, if you want to really kind of dig in further, I recommend 3 books that you should read. So the first is Crossing the Chasm. The book talks about when you have an idea or a technology that has potentially many applications and many customers, how do you go about choosing the right customer for that idea, and how do you then grow that into the full potential for the business? So I highly recommend you read that book. The second book is The Startup Owner's Manual. It talks about what we've talked about today, customer discovery. How do you actually write your business model hypothesis? How do you go talk to customers? How do you approach them to validate your business model? And then the third is the Business Model Generation book. The book actually talks about that business model canvas that I showed you earlier, and it explains all the different building blocks, and it gives you different ideas about how you can design your business model for your startup. So that's the goal for today's presentation. This is a very big topic. We can spend lots of time breaking it down. But I'm always happy to connect with anyone in the audience who wants to kind of discuss or ask questions for me personally, and if you're looking for any feedback for your idea. So that's the slides for today. I'm going to open it back up to the audience to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, so my name's Preston. I was curious. I was an entrepreneur starting out my career. I was successful for a young man. I was 18 and I was making enough money to pay my bills, but because I had taken business classes and stuff. But my biggest problem was I didn't get stakeholders involved, and I was stubborn. I thought I could just pay my own bills. And what do you think about a startup? How early should they get, like you said, venture capitalists, people that are going to invest in your idea and business? How early, and then how early, because you said startups they're not quite there with a business model. How soon should they come up with the business model once they get venture capitalists involved, people who are going to invest money in growing and scaling, going vertical and things?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think the first thing to do is to find a problem, right? That's what we're talking about today. You really want to find a problem, and you kind of want to be in a position where you have let's just assume that you created like a new smartphone, right?
Sure.
You want to be in a place where you have you can document somewhat demand for your product, right? Like let's say you talk to 1,000 people, and 1,000 people went to your landing page and they put a down payment for the new smartphone that you created, right? Because why that's important is once you have that demand, right, it's very easy to go to an investor and say, hey, I have this product, right? I have these customers that want to pay me for it, right? But I need capital, right, to go build it out. So the first thing I would advise people is really figure out the customer side. Once you figure that out, everything else is easier, right? So once you figure that out, then the question then is,
you kind of bring the product to the venture capitalist, and they say, okay, I can see where the profit margin would be.
Yep.
Things like that.
Yeah, always start there, and then the rest of it is I think venture capital is great, but if you can build your business by yourself, with your own funds, I can bootstrap it. That's also a viable pathway. But I think what's more important to answer your question is you want to find other entrepreneurs, right, who are doing something similar, maybe not directly competitors to your product, that are in a place where you would like to be one day, right? So every idea could be a small company or it could be a big company, right? And it could be a medium-sized company. So again, depending on your preference, right, you want to kind of find people who are in that
line of work.
In that line of work, right, that can give you ideas about how you grow to a certain place, right? That's always important to do as well. And, I think one of the things to know if you go down the venture capital route, venture capitalists are looking for a big exit, so
Right.
they're looking at your idea or your business exiting for conservatively $100 million, right? More realistically, they want a $1 billion exit, depending on how much you put in your business. And not every business is a venture backable business, right? So it's also important to think about, as an entrepreneur, do you have all the resources that you need to solve your customers' problems? And if so, then you can find other creative ways to fund the business. So those are just some thoughts, to answer your question.
And I think it has to do, if like you're the CEO, how big you want to scale it to. Like, do you want other people to be involved, or do you want to take that more, you could say what you said, that biblical path, and just keep reinvesting your profits back in yourself?
Yep. So that's spot on. I think it's always good to have mentors and advisors just who are always advising you. But yeah, you don't always have to go to venture capitalists, right, to start off the process.
All right, great point.
Any other questions?
Lalo, I have a question for you.
Yes, go ahead.
I'd like to better understand the differentiation that you're making between a startup looking for a business model and a regular business. On one end, you have an entrepreneur that is trying to develop an Airbnb. And on the other side, you may have somebody who's starting to start a restaurant to sell Russian food.
Yeah.
So what's the difference in your mind between those two?
Yeah. So I think, if you're starting a restaurant, right? A restaurant is a very clear, it's a business that you're executing, right? You're not really trying to figure out a business model. The business model for a restaurant is that, you make food, people come, they buy the food, they sit down and eat. There's really nothing creative about that. You're executing there. Or if you buy an Airbnb, if you buy a property and use it for Airbnb, it's really not a startup, right? Because of the business model is pretty clear and you're just executing against that idea. What a startup is when you're developing some kind of innovation where, it's not very clear who the customer is, what the business model is. So when you think about like the founders of Airbnb, when they started Airbnb, right, they had an idea, but they were not really sure if people were going to, want to open their homes for other people to come in and things like that, right? That's a startup, right? A startup is searching, right, for that business model. But now Airbnb is no longer a startup, right? Because now they know that customers are people who want to, who are looking for alternatives to hotel, who pay, who pay to live in someone else's home. So that's, I don't know if that's helpful, but, essentially some businesses are executing and right, they're not startups because they are just executing against a plan that's pretty well known versus some are looking for, who the right customer is for their business.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yep. You're welcome.
Hey, Ade, it's Amy here.
Hi, Amy.
Hi. I have a question for you about your customers and have you experienced any shifts that, especially in the past year, right? You're in telehealth and, the sentiments around that have been sort of reticent in the past. And so have you experienced any shifts in this past year? And if so, were those shifts, did they accelerate? Did they decelerate your business? And then the last part of the question is, did they also force you to make changes to your business model?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes to all of them. So when we started out, our original idea was that our customer was going to be a cardiac rehab center, right? So a cardiac rehab center is like a physical therapy clinic, and they have patients come in and they do cardiac rehab in the clinic, and patients leave. And so initially we thought that we could build a platform that we could sell to rehab centers to enable them to deliver care virtually. Now, so we built out the first version of the product and we started to sell to cardiac rehab centers, and we got some of them to adopt it, but we learned that they were not quite the right customers for us. And the reason for that was for reasons that were, not obvious at the time. So one was the insurance companies back then were not reimbursing for telehealth. So the cardiac rehab centers couldn't make money by using our platform. So that was one. Two, many rehab centers were understaffed. So even if they wanted to use our product, they just didn't have enough staff to really manage more patients, and it was hard for them to get budgets. And those two things really kind of made us to rethink, who our customers were. So fundamentally, when we think about our business, the people who benefit the most from our product are the patients. These are people who've had a heart attack, they don't want to get a second one, so they want to do their rehab and they want to recover, and they need that support, right? So the benefit is very clear to a patient, right? The benefit is also very clear to an insurance company, right? An insurance company, for every time someone has a heart attack, they're paying almost $30,000 to the hospital to manage that patient, right? And so I'll give you an interesting statistic. 50% of people who have a heart attack will get a second one within 1 year. Very interesting, right? And so that means that insurance company is spending on average maybe $60,000, for every time someone has a heart attack and has a second heart attack. So we then realized that the people who really benefited from our product were not necessarily the cardiac rehab centers per se, but they were the patients and the insurance company. And so we redid our business model to where essentially, instead of trying to sell our platform to rehab centers, we said, why don't we become our own virtual clinic and contract directly with the health plans? So in our business model and how it's evolved, we built a technology, but we also have the clinicians as well that deliver the care to the patients. And we go contract with a health insurer and say, hey, Mr. Insurer, most of your patients don't do cardiac rehab, and because they don't do it, 50% of them might get readmitted. And if they do cardiac rehab, research shows that the readmission rates are less than 20%. And so we can save you a lot of money if you can get your patients to do our program. And so we go convince an insurance company, they then contract with us, and then they start to send us the patients, and we start to deliver the model. So initially we started out as a technology company, but now we're more of a technology-enabled service, right? Where we're using our technology to actually deliver the care to the program, but we're not selling to hospitals any longer. So hopefully that answers that question for you, but that was kind of a pivot we had to make in our business model.
Excellent, thanks.
We can do one more.
I'm gonna jump in really quickly. Thanks for a great presentation, Ade. I think there's a lot of synergy between my company and yours, given that we're in the remote care space, but in orthopedics instead of cardiovascular health. So my question is more around your customers and your approach to selling, and how that changed when you switched from rehab facilities to insurers. So breaking down the kind of the customer archetype, you have the end users, which are the patients, influencers, which are the doctors, potentially case managers, decision makers, executives, and then buyers, a role within the organization, procurement, sorry. So I'm curious, is that the same? Are those roles the same when selling to insurers? Because I believe the influencers are still the doctors and the case managers, and the patients are still end users. But of course the buyers change. So I'm just really curious about that transition. And
yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that's important in healthcare to understand is how the different stakeholders buy products, right? So an insurance company knows how to pay for three things. They know how to pay for healthcare services, they know how to pay for drugs, and they know how to pay for devices, right? And you want to think about your innovation and which of those buckets closely matches like how they buy things, right? And so for what you're doing, right, and for what I'm doing in particular, right, we ended up deciding to create a service, right, instead of just a technology, because insurance companies don't know how to buy software, right? They don't buy software, right? But they know how to buy rehab services, right? They pay for rehab services, or they pay for physical therapy and things like that. So one of the things we had to do to sell to an insurance company was to go form a medical group that could contract with an insurer, right, as a provider of care. Now, what's unique about our own medical group is that we're based in Los Angeles, right? But we can deliver care virtually using our technology. But in our business model, how we contract with an insurer, we contract the same way any kind of clinic will contract with them, right? And so by just like kind of having that business entity that is designed to contract with an insurer, right? You're going to do business much easier with that insurer, right? And so, so I think in that framework that you kind of mentioned, right, when we think about the different stakeholders, the insurer as the buyer, right, of the service has their own requirements on how they buy product, what kind of like things they look out for. Obviously, they rely very heavily on influencers, which are the doctors, to say, hey, is this service clinically necessary? Do our patients need it? Is the evidence that it works? But every stakeholder has their own checklist of how they want to buy stuff. And a big thing about customer discovery, just for the rest of the audience, is that you really want to understand what it's going to take for your customer to buy, so that you can kind of build your product to be something that is very attractive to them. So John, hopefully that answers the question, but we can always take it offline too, and kind of break that down more.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You guys definitely need to talk.
Yeah,
Ade, John is our an alum and working on something similar, but maybe complementary.
Definitely. We're scheduled to talk already next week. So
excellent. Good. Good. Well, Ade, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. Let's give Ade a round of applause.
Thank you, everybody.
I'm a big fan of Steve Blank and the business model canvas, and it's a very important tool in your toolbox for launching a startup. So I hope you took something away from Ade's presentation. It's incredibly important and valuable. So thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Next month, we're going to have Jessie Martinez. Jessie's up in the Bay Area. He's the founder of the Latinx Startup Alliance and a founder of Vamos Ventures, a venture capital firm that invests in Latino-founded startups. If you're familiar with the research of the School of Management's California Economic Research Forecast, you may know that they particularly study. They've published a lot on Latino GDP in this country. If the Latino population in this country, if you measure its GDP, they're as big as they're the 8th largest country in the world on their own. An incredible amount of industriousness and output and demand from that community, yet they're still underrepresented in as far as startups are concerned. So Jesse's going to talk about his experience as growing up in Texas and his career as a serial entrepreneur and as a venture capitalist. So please attend and hear what Jessie has to say. It's a super important topic. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week or next month. Everyone. Take care.